you're Nigerian, I'm sure you know that our debt profile has risen considerably in the last 6 years, and we woke up to news a couple of days ago talking about Mr. President, President Muhammadu Buhari, writing a letter to both chambers of the National Assembly requesting permission to borrow another, I think, $6.1 billion it was, from multilateral organizations to fund the deficit of the 2021 budget, and it got people worrying again. We're doing a lot more borrowing than we should be, or are we doing maybe just enough? I'm joined now by Mukhtar Mohammed. Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure, Ibuka.
Should we be worried?
No.
Why not?
We shouldn't be worried ordinarily. Ordinarily, debt is good for any economy. It's just like a businessman. You want to expand your business, you need to do a lot of borrowing to do expansion. Nobody does expansion or build with just your own resources alone. You tend to borrow. Now, the challenge we have as Nigerians is the government is not telling us the real fact, because borrowing in itself is not bad, but our debt to revenue is a problem. So that's their ability to pay back at when due. That is the major challenge that we are having here. It's not because we are borrowing. If you look at the government, when they came in initially, their borrowing plan is always tied to a specific project, and which is good compared to before that we just borrow, then after we borrow, we begin to think of what to do with it. Now the borrows are tied to specific projects. Now this project have a way of having a bandwagon, a snowball effect into other sector of the economy, which is good. But now the worry we have is because if you look at our borrow to the GDP, our borrow and our GDP, that's not a problem. But when you look at our borrowing to debt, debt to revenue, because our major source of revenue is oil. And once those oil revenue comes down, then we begin to have a challenge. And then do you just tend to use all your earnings in paying your debt? So people will wonder, why is the international organization, international donors, individual international corporations are still ready to borrow to Nigeria? It's because they know we have the ability to pay. But now that ability to pay will now have a negative effect on the country, the individual, the citizen of those countries, because that means a lot of projects will be tied to debt. So it takes a long time to be able to pay off those debts over time. But in terms of our debt to GDP, we are okay. Our major challenge is our debt to revenue, which we are most concerned about.
So I think what a lot of people worry about is, like you said, when you borrow, it's tied to a project. A lot of people are not clear about this particular amount now that we're trying to get at what it's supposed to be funding. And we seem to always run, this deficit seems to be very recurring now with Nigeria. And also, does the pandemic have an effect on where things are now with regards to this new round of borrowing? Because the 2021 budget has hardly been touched. We haven't seen a lot being done. A lot of Nigerians will say that. We're barely in the second quarter, and we're talking about a deficit already, which is probably a good thing because you're projecting and you want to plan better. But for the average Nigerian, this doesn't make a lot of sense, I guess is what I'm saying.
You see, the challenge, like I said, with borrowing is that it's more or less like an economic term. If you want to grow your economy, you borrow, you build from bottom to up. You don't go from up to down. So the bottom are the majority of the people that are at the bottom, especially in a developing economy like ours. But the challenge is that people are not seeing the effect of this borrowing in government because it's tied into a long-term project that people think is luxury. We're talking about Repay project, we're talking about power project, we're talking about social intervention project, which doesn't really have effect immediately. In the short term, they don't tend to have effect, but in the long term, you begin to see those effects. When you see the railway comes into Spain, now, a lot of business are not springing up here because they're just people just put in rails on the line, say, oh, how does this benefit me? But in the long run, you're going to see a lot of business spring up, and then it also is the ease of the farmers bringing their crops. So it has a long-term effect. But now when you look at the current borrowing, like the debt management office came up to clear, it's not that it's a new borrowing. It's actually included in the budget. What they're trying to do is to get the National Assembly, they have what we call the medium-term plan. That borrowing is there. They're not telling the National Assembly to approve it now. Does the pandemic has a role in where we are today? Most people will be saying, no, it doesn't have, because our economy was already struggling before the pandemic came in. So, we're struggling before the pandemic came in, but the pandemic worsened it. So, definitely it has an effect. Why are that donor and jet ready to borrow any developed nations? It's because of the pandemic. Because ordinarily it would have been a Herculean task for Nigeria to get people to even want to borrow them money, because they say, look, you are doing well, the price of crude is okay, your benchmark is okay. Because currently our benchmark crude is about $48, and we are doing about $60 to $65 per barrel, which makes it good. So, but when you look at the pandemic, there's a lot of things that have happened in the pandemic that are affecting people now. What the government is trying to do is trying to lift people out of poverty. But the way they go about it, that's one of the challenge most people see. People want quick fix. But in economic terms, the economic strategy doesn't just, economic disaster doesn't just start overnight. It takes time. So, and then fixing it also will have to take time. So it's not that I'm saying that borrowing on itself is good, because you want to borrow to credits like credit. Now these days you see the bank are looking for how to galvanize the economy. We are giving credit to the private sector. It's the same thing with borrowing. When this credit comes in, but where are we really borrowing into? But if you look at it now, I think we are borrowing to build infrastructure, especially in the power and transportation sector.
You mentioned, the benchmark and, oil and all of that. And of course, it's great news at this time for Nigeria. But we know how volatile that sector is. You know how reliant we are on oil. This benchmark, sort of surplus, for want of a better word, has only just happened in the last couple of months. We don't know what's going to happen in a few months. Are you feeling confident? I guess my talk is about paying back. Because people are saying you're mortgaging the future of Nigerians. You guys are not going to be here when this thing blows up in our faces. We're lucky, or I guess strategic enough under President Obasanjo when the minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was able to negotiate, sort of debt relief and all of that at the time. We don't know if that's going to be able to happen again. Do you see something like that happening, or do you see us being able to repay this, or even keep borrowing?
Well, able to repay is a long. If you look at the tenures of these loans, they are already long-term tied to future generations. Yes. And they have to have more momentum, which means that maybe for the next 2 years, the government is not expected to pay anything. Until then, the interest on it, some of them is practically like 0 point something percent, some of them are 2%. That's why the government will tell that we are going to borrow outside, because there are always two ways to borrow. You can borrow via the capital market, and you'll be borrowing at a rate of maybe 16 to 15% in terms of interest you are going to pay. Now we are borrowing from the abroad, foreign borrowing, and you are paying about 6% in some, and some you are even paying like the ones from the donor agents about 2 point something percent to 1 point something percent, then 2%. So, which ordinarily is not supposed to be a challenge. Now, will we be able to repay? Let's look at it this way: are we trying to look inwardly to build in our economy? Now, strategically, we tend to be thinking we are looking inwardly because we are looking at the agricultural sector. We are looking at the petroleum sector. We are trying to expand that sector so that we begin to have local players. Then we begin to refine petroleum products. Once we get that right, then we are able to feed ourselves. The major challenge we have as a nation is in the area of feeding, the basic necessity that every Nigerian needs. Let me give you an example now. We don't import cement any longer because we have been able to take care of that. Even if you say in terms of the price of cement keep going up, then that's where infrastructure comes in. So when we build our infrastructure, we are able to manage some of the materials that we have here. Then we begin to see cost of building materials will come down generally. The same thing with food. Once we begin to consume what we consume what we have here, then we will begin to think of how to export the surplus outside. Then we earn more revenue. So the major challenge that we have as a nation in terms of repayment, because we are looking at only one source of repayment, which is oil. So by the time we diversify into other sources, then we'll begin to see that we don't have a problem in terms of payment. It's like I normally say, it's like a man. If you have only one stream of income, you struggle. But it's from your main stream of income that you begin to develop other streams of income. So now, what are we doing as a nation? We are looking at oil as our benchmark. We are using our resources in oil to try to develop other sectors. But we don't have the resources to develop these sectors through the oil. So we are trying to borrow using the oil sector as our repayment plan, which economically it makes sense. But the challenge we have as a country is in terms of implementations of this policy, what these agreements are, how are these agreements signed? Will we continue to have the Chinese managing these things? Are we trying to train Nigerians to take that? For me, that's the major challenge, not in terms of the borrowing plan. And look at the borrowing, you look at public-private partnership. Look at the airport, the new international wind airport that the Chinese are building for, Chinese corporation are building for us. They're going to manage it for 25 years. After 25 years, they hand it over to us. So are we building our own men to manage it, or after 25 years, we need to tell them again? The same thing with the rail sector. So same with the power sector. We need to begin to build manpower also to be able to take care of it, so that at that time we reduce our dependence on paying these people foreign exchange. So that again will reduce the pressure on our own currency and build up our reserve in the long run.
All right, some optimistic end to that there. Hopefully things pan out like you hope, and don't Nigerians, we can only hope for great things.
Thank you.
And thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
Don't just stand there teasing me. Now it's time to show